What's up? It's Mr. Campaign Man back at it again with... What the... What was... Oh, God. Hey, look. Wake Realms, making another game, and you know what that means. Break out the wallets, gawk at the game found, get super hyped, all in splurge.
I think I'll use my credit card.
Completely forget about it. Years later, it shows up, sits in the Calyx unplayed. We call that the modern board gamer true combo. But that's why I'm here to let you vicariously play the game through me, because being parasocial is obviously a suitable replacement for an IRL playthrough with friends. That, or you need me to tell you it's good so that you feel good about buying it, so that when it sits unplayed in your shelf, you at least know it's a good game that's sitting there. But will I even tell you that Lands of Evershade is good? Ooh. Spoiler alert, this game is everything I've always wanted from Tainted Grail. So, what is Lands of Evershade? Its premise has an adventure set in the lands between, the lands of Evershade, where a long time ago, the god McCrash lived up to his name because he full-on did a McCrash out into the sun and released the seed of void in the god's domain. Now the land is cursed from the broken sun, its deadly rays wiping life and even memories from existence. The moon goddess Luada sacrificed herself to veil the sky and protect us all in its Evershade. But in current times, much has transpired. Entire empires have been erased in blinding light, and conflict arises over scattered divinum and brilliance, godlike materials that empower beings and objects with reality-altering capabilities. As artifacts from the gods, a blighted higher realm periodically fall, Luada's protection steadily fails. New white spots and their accompanying rays of light bleach the land a sickly white as the world appears doomed to fade away. Perhaps hope lies underground, or maybe with the power of the gods, and adventures await those who take it upon themselves to search for godlike powers and answers, whether they're found in the desolate white Fadelands or partaking in shaded conflicts with those who wield divinum. This is where you, the adventurer, comes in. The Lands of Evershade is a campaign game that's blending ttrpg and board game. Awaken Realms are, for real, making you create a character, stats and background and all, in a board game. Like there's a player's handbook in my family fucking friendly dark fantasy board game? Ain't no way. Here's how to play Lands of Evershade. The game is for 1 to 5 players and plans on having 3 adventures, campaigns, whatever you want to call them. Each one has 3 chapters, and each chapter has 2 acts, with each act taking anywhere from 30 minutes to upwards of like 2.5 hours depending on your story choices. For this prototype, we're playing the first adventure, Into the White Well, where you hunt down a divinum-infused murderer hellbent on obtaining as much power as possible by killing other divinum users, eventually winding up in the city of Whitewell and tangling yourself into shady political intrigue and dealings with godly artifacts in your search for the murderer. Lands of Evershade is fundamentally divided into 2 modes of operation. You're either doing stuff in the overworld with the storybook, or you're doing grid-based combat, with tons of dice rolling either way. No matter which side of the game you're doing, it's going to be represented through the usage of these big sheets called secret sheets, which the game will direct you to get out depending on what you're doing contextually in your adventure. It's typical for the table to have one sheet being an exploratory overworld you're running around in that has locations which direct you to the Choose Your Own Adventure storybook, and then another sheet with a grid instead of a map that gets brought out when you do something that starts a fight in the story. Both types of sheets will have special rules and objectives listed on them so you have an idea of what you're supposed to be doing and how story contextual rulings work. The vehicle by which you engage with these systems is your character, which you'll create with the help of the player's handbook. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. An outright ttrpg player's handbook filled with tons of different customization options and lore to create a character specifically tailored to whatever it is your little heart desires. That, or you can just use pre-built characters if you want to be like every other board game campaign. The 3 main aspects of your character will be their race, origin, and profession. You got your fantasy all-stars here with elves and dwarves. You can be a street urchin, a wandering vagabond, an aristocrat, and of course course, you can be stuff like a fighter, a paladin, a druid, etc. Depending on who your character is, you have vastly different starting stats, items, actions, and keywords, which are like character traits that the story can check for if you need to be, say, intimidating or stealthy. Your stats are primarily used for rolls, where you'll be asked to do stat checks, like Strength 10, which means roll an amount of d12s, yes, this is a d12 system, equal to your strength stat, with each die needing to meet or exceed 10 to count as a success. Then, depending on the amount of successes rolled, you'll get a different outcome. Items can come with raw number improvements to things like damage and armor, as well as providing new actions listed on their back. Actions are how you'll do, well, actions during combat, and they'll usually make you roll for something to do what you'd expect, like attack, heal, dodge, etc. Speaking of, let's explain combat, since exploration is super simple. It consists almost entirely of special rules pertaining to the secret sheet and storybook while making choose your own adventure decisions together and doing a bunch of stat rolls. In a combat round, everything is going to take a minimum of 1 turn before going to next round. Turns will be done based on what is drawn from this initiative bag, which will have white, black, and dual tokens. In order to determine who takes the next turn, draw from the bag. If you pull white, the party decides which of them will take the token and take a turn. Black, and all enemies of that type next in line will activate. This order is determined by combat setup instructions. Dual means treat it as the opposite of what was drawn for the previous turn. Once all player characters have taken a turn, the round ends. But if any enemies have yet to activate, they go now in order left to right, just like drawing black tokens. Then return all tokens to the bag, boom, next round, pull the next token. On a character's turn, they get 2 actions. There's these basic actions like move and heal, with movement being orthogonal and you can move past allies but not enemies. But the real shit comes from your action cards and anything that's special from the secret sheet. Action cards specify how they work, usually saying something like requires this kind of item, targets in this range, rolls this stat, does this based on amount of successes with difficulty depending on the enemy. After doing an action, it flips face down, in which case it's unavailable until it refreshes. Though some actions have text on the back for further unique effects like passives or refresh restrictions. You refresh all your stuff at the start of your turn, by the way. Oh yeah, also some of these are reactions, not actions. So like for instance, support abilities to add dice to allies rolls, or defensive reactions to reduce incoming damage. While they don't count against your 2 actions a turn, you can only use 1 reaction per applicable trigger if there's multiple available, so you can't use 2 defensive reactions when attacked. On an enemy's turn, they draw an activation card from their own deck, and if there's multiple of that type, they all do what's listed on the card top down. Each step makes all of that enemy do it in ascending order before going to the next step. Usually this is going to be they all move to the listed target and attack for this damage and this roll difficulty if you defensive reaction. Of course, there's a bunch of pathing nuances, but if there's multiple valid targets, players do choose tiebreakers. Your win/loss conditions are listed on the secret sheet, and losing by default is when all characters hit 0 HP or gain 4 terror, which is a rarer form of mental damage. If there are only some characters at 0 HP or 4 terror, they're removed from the battle and can come back to the fight if they're healed. However, be careful with this because whenever your HP hits 0, you also gain an injury token, which takes a while to get rid of. And if you go past 3 of those, your character outright dies. So don't get back up only to immediately go down again and farm injury tokens. Also, it's possible to fail the adventure if everyone dies, so be warned. Finally, all your character progression and upkeep happens whenever you hit camp phases while doing your thing in the overworld. It's here you'll actually get to rest up and heal, equip new things, change out your action cards because you have limited slots, trade between each other, and level up. So, plot out your loadouts, healing, and progression accordingly with your travel plans because the current secret sheet will detail how to access your limited camp phases. You'll gain EXP whenever the game tells you to, and each time you hit the next threshold, you take one of these advancement tokens and put it into one of your 3 advancement trees when resting to unlock the next thing on that tree. Could be increased stats, new action cards, new keywords, etc. Now for disclaimers, the prototype only contains 1 campaign out of 3 that are planned, which we play through entirely 3-player. Additionally, there's still plenty of features that aren't fully fleshed out, so we couldn't get the true experience of, say, all of the classes, or this mechanic called Secret Origins for your characters. Lastly, before pros and cons, this is paid sponsored content. Thank you to Awaken for sending over the prototype and supporting this video. While I feel like I'm being honest with my takes and these scores, I can't really self-police because I don't got eyes on the inside, so if you feel like I got implicit biases that are fucking everything up, That's super valid. Pros! Components. For starters, what kind of Awaken Realms game would this be if there weren't sick minis and tons of evocative art everywhere? When I look at these blue fuckers, that shit is unbelievably cool and adds another dimension to their Sundrop painted minis option, because like with some extra color in there, this is even more gorgeous looking. I mean, also that's just a cool sculpt because this is a magical enemy that's like glitching out and it has sections of their body completely split off from each other. Also, the minis for player characters will have colored base rings and matching colored effect tokens to mark stuff as your ability is affecting that thing. Very nice. Love to see accommodations to make gameplay pieces easily distinguishable. And of course, because this is a prototype, these are basically fake fraud minis that easily snap. Don't worry if you see these broken parts, because in the final product you guys would be getting an actual insert and proper minis that aren't so brittle. I've also played with finished products from Awaken Realms. Their minis always turn out sick. Wouldn't worry about that. Also on that note, this prototype is gonna have missing / duplicate art and jank components in addition to a rough draft rulebook that was only on Google Docs. So I'm only gonna be able to talk about the more concrete aspects about what was sent over. Yet despite the prototype jank, dude, a huge W from the art team, because like there's awesome looking Elden Ring coded art everywhere here. Like it is so easy to do that thing with every TTRPG where you just lose yourself reading the player's handbook, soaking in the world and all the art and lore. Awaken Realms have done it again with crafting a fucked up world that's falling apart and then drawing beautiful vistas of it that make you want to explore the shit out of it. It's not even just the book, because the cards have full art most of the time, so the drawings are loud and clear while playing. And these secret sheets are basically just excuses to put entire sheets of art into the game. And these secret sheets. Oh, these secret sheets. I got so much good shit to say about these sheets. You remember how we praised Gloomhaven Jazz of the Line for having a scenario book that you just open up and put the minis directly onto? And that shit popped off so hard that a ton of people wanted scenario booklets for even the big box Gloomhaven games? Look at this. Do you not see this shit? It's the same fucking thing, but even better! First, you obviously are gonna get full art of whatever the hell locale you're doing your thing in. Beautiful, based, bussin'. Cannot understate enough just how impactful that is for drawing you into the story when everything is illustrated, both the overworld and combat arenas. Second, this guarantees that the play space isn't gonna be a massive table hog that not everyone can see and reach properly, which can happen with particularly large levels and tile-based maps, or even Tainted Grail Fall of Avalon as an example, where the map could devolve into cards going everywhere if you were exploring the edges. However, Sheets retains this benefit over a book while also still having the possibility of being more modular if there's ever a need to place an additional sheet, or if they want to make a slightly larger sheet. Third, you're not going to run into the issue of the rings in the middle getting in the way of certain spaces on the board, nor are you going to run into the issue of when there's different elevation levels for different pages. And lastly, if you ever wanted to go back and look at prior sheets without disrupting your current one, that's also a possibility because you can't turn pages with minis on them. Oh, and also shout out to the camp sheet for this awesome feature where you can slot in cards to modify what's essentially your group's bonfire rest point, because the cards end up lining up perfectly with the camp sheet art and is an overall very evocative and intuitive way to visualize all of your out of combat upkeep. Speaking of slots, these dual layered boards have a ridiculous amount of slots, which is so nice when there's a million tokens to put into everything in this board gamification of a TTRPG character sheet. How well did they pull that off? Amazingly. I so prefer this over having a bunch of cards and markers sprawled everywhere in front of you, while Lands of Evershade is super neat and tidy. They managed to make a character sheet that's conveying a bunch of TTRPG information without just defaulting to writing it all down on a sheet of paper and getting graphite smudges plus eraser shavings everywhere on your table. This shit radiates premium board game component. And even better, even if you don't get the deluxe version with upgraded components, you still get to have dual layered character boards. You don't get dual layered everything else though, and I got words for that in the cons. But otherwise, in the deluxe version that actually has all the minis and upgraded components, the way everything slots into everything is so nice for not just intuitiveness, but also satisfying tactile feel. Like the secret sheets slot perfectly under the dual layered story tracker so they won't jostle around during gameplay. And on that end, nothing can slip out in general because all these token slots have been designed with ridges that catch on the board. So yeah, when it comes to distilling the TTRPG character sheet formula down to a campaign board game experience, this is the way to do it. Like sure, writing everything down means unlimited possibility, but remember, this is still a board game. There ain't no GM to referee everything, so it's smarter to come up with limits and then design around them. Because every stat, skill, item, whatever is a component, it ensures you won't be able to break the game by getting an absurd amount of any given stat. And it guarantees a streamlined, readable experience because you can't go overboard by having a million different character traits and equipment that aren't gonna fit into the available slots. This still offers plenty of choice and room for character progression, but within limits they can balance around, and with very parsable information. Anything that's in a slot is being used. If your other tiles in your character's pouch is not in use, super elegant. Final slot thing is how the time token slot in the story tracker is a neat little novelty. Feels way cooler than just having a dial sitting somewhere on your table, because this is a nice focal point. And because it's not a dial, it can be swapped out for whatever thematic time tracking means they want to use, like whole days, hours, or even brief moments. Moving on from the big money component stuff that may or may not have been deluxe, let's talk about more player ease of use stuff. Like how every single card has an identifier code, which results in extremely easy organization. It is so much easier to look for a specific letter and number whenever the game asks you to dig something out, because you're gonna organize it all by the numbers. But if you're only working with names, it's harder to come up with an organization method besides like alphabetical. But even then, it doesn't work as well if they're supposed to be grouped in specific ways, like these are basic actions, those are item specific, etc. We also got clear and distinct icons with very different shapes, and all of them are right there on the player aid. Plus, action cards have a letter on the bottom right that clues you in as to what's on the back of the card. Like R means this card has a unique refresh condition, and P means there's a passive ability that's live while this card is exhausted. Furthermore, action cards on the left have easy categorization based on shapes for offensive, defensive, and support. On top of being dark if it's an action and light if it's a reaction, which makes your action hotbar also really easy to understand. Like, oh, this slot accepts offensive only. This one can be offensive or support. Yes! Love seeing user-friendly shit like this. Anytime graphic designers come up with ways to make it so you parse information more instantaneously, the better. Also, it's nice that the enemy activation cards are clearly divided into numbered steps with names on each step. Could have easily been a blob of text. Very glad that wasn't the case. Last bit of random pros that can be said about this prototype is that they gave a ton of D12s. Like, even when our group decided to pump up a roll by dumping a bunch of resources into it, it still didn't feel like we were constantly passing around dice. While this isn't true for the standard dice set, you don't always use those like with the D12s. And because these aren't dice with special faces, these are just normal numbered dice, you can thankfully just use any dice you already have laying around. Huge fan of that. I don't remember what Warhammer or D&D video I randomly watched that convinced me of that. But yeah, having specialized dice is really annoying for going between games. Like, if you want dice with unique icons on them, it can be worth considering to instead have like cards that have a chart of outcomes on it for each number value, which is also more modular, so that instead of a bunch of different dice types, you can instead just have a bunch of different cards. Oh yeah, there's also plenty of number dials to count up bigger numbers like boss health. Very nice to have, and usually much better than tokens or the Awaken Realms classic of red and purple cubes as generic counting markers, which are still here. Can't be an Awaken Realms game without them. But yeah, point is, there's never going to be an issue counting anything with all these markers and dials. Final pro, they've done it again. You can borderline just hop right into the game without even touching the rulebook. The player's handbook is organized how you would expect, because at the beginning is all the character creation stuff organized by chapter for every aspect of a character, so you pick race and background and profession. Then once you're done, you can just go right into the storybook and it will have tutorial redirection verses as you're playing through. Always a fan of this approach. If done well, it always means that the game's core rules are simple enough to do this, or they've carefully picked apart which rules are key to understand and introduced them steadily to you more and more as you play. Love how this onboarding method makes it so you always understand the fundamental important stuff so that it isn't muddled together with more niche rules that you can always go to the rulebook for when they come up. Gameplay pros! Alright, here's the meat of the game, and arguably what the prototype hopes to shine the biggest spotlight on, and holy fuck, they've done it! This feels like what Tainted Grail always should have been. On God, this is what Elden Ring was to Dark Souls, because the exploration has reached insane heights that fucking maximize Awaken Realms' design strengths. Fundamentally, you're just doing the same shit as Tainted Grail. You're exploring an overworld. It leads to choose your own adventure. Every now and then, there's combat. But the way these things are done are all improved, especially the combat, because I'm sorry, but playing cards against an enemy card is just never gonna evoke the same feelings as having minis moving around on a grid, especially a grid with art on it. First, let's start off with the most foundational mechanic in Lands of Evershade, the D12 system. Like any good old ttrpg, whenever there's a skill check, test, roll, whatever you want to call it, anytime there's a problem that your characters face, if you got the applicable skill set, you can roll for it. And just like a lot of ttrpgs, everything revolves around these skill checks. Like, if you understand what your character's traits are that affects your rolls, you're basically like 80% of the way there to being able to play the game. Same holds true in Lands of Evershade, considering how similarly D12 rolls work both in and out of combat. And I want to note that the content here is like 60-40 in favor of the exploration side of the game. Like, there really isn't a ton of combat. Still a good amount of it, and every time it's super impactful because secret cheats, but not non-stop. Though because of how exploring and the choose your own adventure book works, with your choices, you can make it so that you deal with way more or way less combat. As a result, the majority of the time spent in this game will be in the overworld, mulling over your past decisions and what to do next to advance the plot. Whenever obstacles get in your way, you roll for them, whether that's sneaking into a locked room, convincing/lying someone to get in, or just a brute forcing it, you do the D12 roll based on your character's strengths. And I think the game feels designed with this exploration leaning content ratio in mind because it feels like they never want to bog you down with combat mechanics and want to keep the game flow brisk and evocative as its primary form of engagement. That doesn't mean that there's no depth, but rather that you don't get a ton out of sitting there muttering to yourself as you crunch the numbers at every possible turn. Like, first off, a D12 is harder to do the probability on versus like a D10 or a D20. Also, because there's rerolls in the form of fate as a mechanic, combined with how often you're rolling in addition to tests having varied difficulties plus amounts of successes needed, you're way better off just like vibing it out and sticking to thematic decisions like what your characters are good at or what's happening contextually. Oh yeah, fate, it's a thing, and it's really good bad luck protection. Essentially, whenever you fail a roll, you get a fate, which can be spent in a lot of ways, especially in combat. But primarily, it's used to reroll, which is a really good way of preventing the possible frustration of not being able to make progress because you keep failing everything. Like, even if you're abysmally unlucky, assuming you're doing checks for your high stats, you're at worst failing like every other time. Cause ain't no way you're dropping checks if you're rolling like 4 to 5 dice and can reroll all of them. And even if you're failing everything, you're still getting fate. You can also get fate from each nat 1 that pops up as the final result after rerolls. So even if you're hilariously lucky, you can still interact with this mechanic if, say, a test needed 2 successes at a value of 9 and you rolled this. You can still pass the test and get a fate, which also means you can run into these absolutely hysterical situations where you're the guy doing the roll, you get a bunch of 1s and fail, but you're tempted to keep the roll because, ooh, free fate, even though you already have fate and are just being hilariously greedy. Meanwhile, your friends are screaming at you, please bro, don't do this, reroll please, we really need to steal that guy's keys. Also, nat 12s count as 2 successes. So overall, I'd say that when it came to the luck aspect of this game, it really nails the ttrpg feel while probably skewing the odds a little more in your favor, which is arguably necessary design since unlike a regular ttrpg, the GM can fudge rolls or just force the game to continue working smoothly despite bad rolls, whereas this being a board game doesn't have that luxury, so it shouldn't just brickwall the players for being too unlucky. I'd say it felt like we succeeded like 80-something% of the time with pretty good management of our fate. Definitely felt like every now and then we got unlucky and something stupid happened that resulted in us considering a different option, which is very D&D 5e vibes. On top of that, there's rarer auxiliary sources of fate generation like abilities, but also you can improve your luck with aura boons, which are these buffs you can get that can be consumed to improve your stats for 1 roll only. Awesome way to build a support character just handing these out to people. And nice to have more ways to mull over how to improve your odds. And in case you're wondering what the standard dice set is for, then that's for what's called your character's div die. Because everyone is playing as people with some amount of superpowers from Divinum, some abilities you have ask you to roll your div die value. Like maybe you need to succeed the D12 check and then roll your div die to further adjust the action's efficacy. Extremely thematic and a great mechanic when actions call for it, because it's another way to have to look at your abilities beyond just your stats and gear. You really feel how it affects your power level and its innate alluring nature, because yeah, no wonder people in this world do fucked up shit killing each other for more divinum, because you too will potentially run into heinous options leading to you gaining more and increasing your divinum die value. So overall, the point I'm trying to make about Lands of Evershade's dice system is that it works wonderfully with what they've ended up layering on with their design. You want to keep the core system simple without sacrificing too much depth, because not only do they want people more focused on the story, but this also paves the way for how the exploring choose your own adventure side of the game as you spend that time purely interacting with special rules laid out on the secret sheets, which would be so much more tedious if everything was more bloated. It's so important to keep the game moving if every act you're pulling out a new sheet that introduces another paragraph of rules specifically tailored to whatever is happening in the plot. Whether that's exploring the overworld to a street chase or a dungeon delve. That couldn't really be done at this brisk of a pace if the rules weren't literally roll d12s using the stat the test asks for to see if you succeed. Combat is you have 2 actions. make sure you know how to read your stats. Like, I'm not even kidding, that's basically it for core rules, and everything else comes from special rules in the secret sheets. This holds true for the simple yet thoughtful and very thematic combat, because again, it's pretty hard to be overly precise about mathing out possibilities when enemies not only have hidden information from the behavior decks, but also will have varying difficulty values for successes when attacking / defending against them. Again, if we want ttrpg vibes, you want players talking like, I'm gonna sprint over there and shove that guy off the platform, over, with my 4 strength, the odds of me dealing lethal 5 damage from 2 successes at difficulty 7 plus 3 damage from my weapon versus the odds of using the secret sheet specific push action. It's things like that which further sell the fantasy Lands of Evershade offers, which is paramount when these fights are always the result of build-up from the storybook, and can even have you go back into the storybook mid-combat for stuff like certain actions. Or maybe the boss has a phase 2. That's why it's so important to make sure players have a solid vibe as to what's going to be a likely / unlikely result without giving them perfect knowledge and devolving into analysis paralysis or working out the most optimal play. Especially if you want them to be interacting with the secret sheet's unique rulings and actions. By the way, those unique actions are a pretty damn good replacement for those moments when you ask the GM, hey, can I do this insane stupid shit? Cause yeah, obviously you can't be completely freeform here, but they're pretty good about giving you those wacky room contextual actions that you'd want to do if you learn that this room has explosive barrels or a chain holding up a platform. I mean, look at this. This is actually just inviting you to do Looney Tunes nonsense straight out of Baldur's Gate 3. Now, obviously you're not gonna be doing custom actions every step of the way during combat. Fundamentally, with your 2 actions, you'll likely end up doing a move and an attack card, or 2 attacks if you positioned yourself well. But that's fine. It doesn't have to be super crunchy when it's clear the focus isn't heavy mechanical depth. And there's enough layers of obfuscation from RNG on top of a ton of different factors modifying your actions that are fun to consider and play around. Like, as an example, deciding who's taking their turns is something you definitely have to consider so that enemies don't go back to back and do a ton of damage. Or maybe someone really needs to take their turn because that's the only time they refresh their face down actions. Also, shout out to the action cards flipping as a system, very intuitive, and a cool way to add effects on the back of them. There's a lot of room for cool design ideas here because while playing, it was surprising just how many ways they made attacks unique from one another beyond just different attacks do different amounts of damage and range and require different weapon types. But back to the taking turns thing, don't know if you caught this during the how to play, but a round only ends when all the player characters go once. So if you're unlucky enough or the initiative bag is loaded up with black chips, enemies can potentially take multiple turns around, which is super dangerous. This is also another thematic lever for the game to pull to make you care about how combat gets initiated, because frequently if enemies get the better of you, the fight starts disadvantaged initiative-wise. So like an example would be like, I don't know, 1 white chip, 2 dual, and 3 black. In situations like that, you have to think carefully whenever you draw white about who's going to be taking their turn and the very real possibility that the enemies take 2, maybe even 3 turns afterwards. It's not all doom and gloom in those situations, because there are actions that can add more white chips to the initiative bag. But you are spending an action to do that, so maybe consider your choices in the storybook with more weight if you think combat may erupt at any moment. There's a huge difference from failing to negotiate with guards and having them seize you versus jumping them in an alleyway or even avoiding them altogether. Ultimately, this drawing from an initiative bag system is really well done for being fast and also being thoughtful, because it doesn't grind every round to a halt by making everyone stop and have to figure out the exact turn order of everything from rolling everyone's initiative or something. Next, I'm gonna rapid fire a bunch of neat little pros about the combat, like how minions always have 1 health, so they're very easy to track and you don't have a bookkeeping nightmare with damage counters scattered everywhere. Makes them feel like minions. There's a lot of them, they're deadly in large numbers, since you only have 2 actions, you feel great for killing them. And if they ever need to be durable, they can just be given armor, so you have to hit them with enough damage to even do 1 damage. Depending on circumstances, they either respawn constantly and there's some other main threat, or they are a notable chunk of the threat, so you gotta manage them accordingly and cut them down to hamper incoming total damage. Regardless, works well. Does the minion moniker justice? There's a lot of them, yet they don't cause the gameplay to drag. Terror is a thing, because what kind of Awaken Realms dark fantasy would this be if your character couldn't take mental damage and go crazy? You get 4 of them, and your character becomes ineffective at everything they do. And if it's combat, you get removed from it, just like if your health went down to 0. Terror occupies the aura slots, so they can delete boons. Very much a real threat that matters, and they're slow to heal, kinda like injuries. Plus, it's another fate sync because you can spend fate to block 1 terror, which is a great addition since it's more likely to be unavoidable damage due to thematic reasons like witnessing a murder or seeing divinum spellcasting go horribly wrong. It does feel more bullshit to be KO'd by it in comparison comparison to outright being damaged, so good call there for amply distinguishing terror from health while making it matter. And these two are rulings things that always come up in grid-based games, but keeping in theme of making sure everything is streamlined, big fan of how players choose targeting tiebreak outcomes and how simple the line of sight rules are. So when it comes to targeting, you will commonly see enemies run towards the nearest character, and players decide all ties, making this very easy to understand and fast to execute. You're probably making them hit the player who has the most health and or defenses up. Either that or cards will ask for who has the most suns or moons. You look at all your actions in their current state, because face down might be different, see who has the most of the requested icon, and that player is the target. As usual, tiebreaks are decided by players, so yeah, I don't think we've ever had to pause and stop to look at some targeting movement AI section in the rulebook as a result. Again, very smooth gameplay. Then for line of sight, you literally always have access to ranged abilities to everything on the sheet, unless it's like divided into two entirely different zones or rooms, which I don't think we ever saw. So for most intents and purposes, if your ability says they in range, they in range. There is cover as a mechanic, but it doesn't block a line of sight, it just reduces the incoming action's roll by 1 die. How it works is super simple. If a figure is adjacent to an impassable border, imagine a line that extends from it which divides the grid in half. This figure has cover against everything on the opposite side of this line. I love how easy this is to understand. Makes ranged attacks not a headache. Very smooth gameplay. This next one is an interesting nuance because most enemies that aren't minions have a deck of like 3 or 4 activation cards, and while it is shuffled at setup, after resolving a card for their turn, it just goes to the bottom of their deck. While this may not seem like many actions, it's not going to matter on a first time encounter when you don't know what the enemy does. And once the cards start repeating, it's a saving grace for parties that may not be as experienced because now they can start perfectly anticipating the enemy's turns. In our experience, most of the time when the enemies have all gone through their decks, we were almost done with the encounter. I'd consider our particular group to be pretty good at games, like most of our turns were super efficient with supporting each other and getting off 2 attacks in 1 turn. My assumption then is that for most groups, their typical experience benefits greatly from how this works because it is a safety net that exists if they mess up and get destroyed early on, but manage to stabilize. This creates a comeback situation where if they remember the enemy deck's order, they now have a more reasonable shot at clutching it out. Not something we really took advantage of. Usually if we had someone get KO'd, it was towards the end, so we were still in control. Pretty sure we all know about tempo and how important early kills are. But it is nice that if players aren't building to min-max and choose to be more thematic, there is this saving grace for those who aren't going in with super optimized loadouts. Oh, and speaking of supporting each other, Lands of Evershade has meaningful group play, and in my book puts it way above Tainted Grail's rules for not having the innate con of what I'd summarize as solitaire co-op. Here, you're basically always sticking together and as a result can always help each other out. Which is the way it should be, cause then what the hell's the point of having a party? I've seen plenty of random YouTube videos on D&D 5e where they recommend not splitting up the party for all sorts of reasons. The players interact with each other less, there's more of a headache and bookkeeping to track essentially 2 different games, the GM only attends to one group while the other waits. Anyways, in combat, you will have access to out-of-turn support action cards, which is awesome for group play, and I always encourage co-op games to find ways to add more of these types of effects into their games and not just being able to buff/heal each other on your own turns. Because if you have one of these support cards equipped, now when it's not your turn, you have to be paying attention on other people's turns if you want to get value out of it. And you end up being more engaged in the combat holistically as a result. And by default, as a basic action, everyone does start with a combat insight card. So yeah, make good use of that because there's no reason not to use it once every round since it will refresh anyways on your turn. Plus, since there's KOs and injuries as a mechanic, players who go down can still be participating since revives are on the table. Of course, sometimes they're going to be like, nah, don't revive me because they already have 3 injuries and don't want to get back up and risk actually dying the next time they go down. But there's also the possibility of fighting, say, a pivotal boss and the party feels they need to risk it for super tense and rewarding gameplay if pulled off. Even then, if your character outright dies, the rules say that players should just spend the time making a new character while the rest of the group keeps playing before joining back in. So even player elimination is handled really well here since character creation can easily take up enough time for an entire combat and or tons of exploration. And when it comes to character progression, by the way, it feels like it progresses at a very reasonable rate. Like it feels like after every fight or big story moment, you're getting either a new action or new gear. And I haven't found the gameplay to stagnate from just doing the same thing over and over again in combat. But even if that was a problem, problem? There's a safeguard against that from special rules on the sheets and their unique actions. But you'll very quickly run into loadout decisions because not only can you get extra action cards from leveling up, but items will frequently give them too if they have a number on the back. And because your hotbar can only slot in so many cards, with later slots being locked until you level up enough, you're gonna have to think about what you should be bringing since you might not have time to redo your build if combat just happens upon you from the storybook. Point is, items being attached to their own action cards lets them be more special than, say, if they were just a stat buff, and really makes different weapons noteworthy in this way with their different attacks. For small items, yeah, you kind of expect that if you equip an herb, you can do an action to heal with it, but it works well with this action card system for when you find magical knickknacks and useful trinkets that grant unique actions. Regardless, the action card system and how it interacts with your class and items really feels like you're giving a lot of options without being super overwhelming and having to prepare like a million spells, slowing down the game whenever you rest. It's also really good for replayability because not only are there tons of different classes, they also have different build paths, and you'll be chasing different items and completely different stats and actions as a result. Campaign pros! Again, I cannot stress enough how great the D12 system is for its speed while still representing character stats super tangibly. And it's really important to understand that beyond that core system, basically all of the actual rules of this game come from these sheets. And they pull this off spectacularly. Secret sheet special rules are not just great for being an all-in-one component for compartmentalizing rules, but also gets to be your map, your puzzle, your room, whatever it needs to be, it can be. Most other games would have circumstantial rules all jammed into the storybook, or maybe you have a pile of quests or story cards and you're working with map tiles or map cards or whatever. Lands of Evershade instead just uses these beautiful secret sheets as the master key solution to everything technically story related. So nothing rules wise is scattered over a table. It's all right there, right on the map. That also comes with tons of clarity in regards to whenever you decide on choices involving where to go and what to expect to find there. If you talk to NPCs and they note that certain areas are frequented by certain people and those people's interests get clarified as you continue to explore, you're gonna be acting with intent. Wow, who would have thought? But yeah, I don't think it ever felt like we were completely blindsided by choices, and because of how well Lands of Evershade builds its world and levels, everything feels so alive and lived in. Combine that with how the choose your own adventure decisions tend to have good follow-up text to further clarify your choices, and yeah, I don't think we ever ran into that issue where your choices don't come out the way you intended. Which is sick that the game is so in tune with your understanding of it, because it also doesn't spoil anything to do this. But yeah, the world of Evershade is really gripping with its unique premise of the broken sun and how that's affected all the people who live here. It's so satisfying and enthralling to travel through it, learning more, uncovering mysteries, getting involved with people's conflicts, and holy shit do you get involved. Like, the instant you step foot in Whitewell, you are immediately thrust into some Game of Thrones bullshit with all the scheming and backstabbing just without the backshotting. Cause yeah, without spoiling anything, I'm sure you can piece together that there's some insane shit going on if you're chasing down a murderer who's killing people to steal their divinum, and it leads you to Whitewell, which is like a big deal city. Part of why this all works better here is definitely the player's handbook with all its lore dumps and sick art. Cause in other campaign board games, unless you're a super active follower of their crowdfunding page, you basically just immediately get thrust into the game without knowing anything. Meanwhile, Lands of Evershade is a proper ttrpg in a board game. Like, this game by far provides the most world building to sink your teeth into right out of the box. To the point that you could feasibly just hand this to someone completely out of the loop and they can still get sucked in extremely early on. Something like this player's handbook is always what I felt was missing from every other campaign game to sate your curiosity whenever you wanted to know more about whatever facet of the fantasy world happens to catch your interest. Which, speaking of, you don't even have to read all the lore, because while I read through this whole thing front to back because I'm review-brained, it ended up being redundant a good number of times because the story makes sure to insert plenty of slice of life moments where you get to witness the workings of this world firsthand. You will see people afflicted with dim rot, a mold which thrives in the dark and can grow on people, needing sunlight to burn it away. You'll see people get disappeared from the broken sun and then watch as your characters completely forget about them. You'll see how Whitewell has the rich and powerful actually on the outside of the city by the wall instead of in the center, because that's where a part of Luada's disc happened to break away and the sun is glaring down there. God, what a cool fantasy city. Look, however much you choose to engage with the lore, you're in good hands either way, because the story and world building here is really strong. Like, it's giving Oathsworn exploration vibes with how you pull out a sheet and run around looking for answers and getting involved in the world before building up to moments of conflict. Just instead of being like The Witcher and hunting down a big monster to do a boss fight, you're instead doing all sorts of varied actions due to the secret sheet specialization and then having it build up to essentially dungeon crawler combat. such a good sense of pacing. On that note, I think Awaken Realms have also finally cracked the case on finally making a good rest phase that feels like a proper save point bonfire. I feel like they tried to dabble with this in the past to invoke Soulsborne gameplay, but Lands of Evershade definitely does it the best. The camp phase being its own sheet that can be modified with cards based on either upgrading your facilities or because NPCs join you and you can talk to them makes this all not only super thematic, but also mechanically meaningful. Depending on how tense the story is being at any given time, you'll have varying amounts of access to camp phase. Sometimes there's a clock ticking down and you need to budget your limited rests. Other times you're in a dangerous area and you legitimately need to find what are essentially save points that allow you to perform a camp phase there. This works phenomenally and is such a good way to make sure mechanics like injuries and horror matter because camping is how you usually slowly heal them. On top of making it a relief if people are low on health or maybe they just got enough EXP to level up and really want to redo their loadout. Like, it really does bring out that same sense of finding a Soulsborne bonfire after an arduous trek. Furthermore, because you aren't a walking army, you do have limited application of all your campsite utilities because some stations are limited, so you really have to talk with your party about who's going to do what by placing their minis there, especially if you got NPCs that you want to talk to. Which brings me to how the exploration group play is also a huge step up from Tainted Grail since you almost always move together as a party on the overworld. In Lands of Evershade, you're constantly making decisions as a group. Plus, you also get to decide who's the one that performs the role and who's helping them out. This is where keywords matter a lot more because individually having a keyword that matches what's listed in the check adds 1 extra die. Yes, even if you have multiple keywords, you still only add 1. But as a group, anyone else who has a listed keyword can also help with 1 die. And a cool nuance there is that supporting characters are making their own role, which may be affected by their own abilities. Because it's not like the person doing the skill check just adds everything up and rolls everyone's dice as 1 roll, because then otherwise that would make the fate reroll absolutely bonkers if you could reroll that many dice. But yeah, keywords are an excellent way to provide meaningful benefits for playing your character to who they are and their individual strengths. And checks also don't feel exceedingly pigeonholed because most of them acknowledge multifaceted solutions, meaning there will be a list of keywords, and reminder, you only need 1 of them. So it's very common that teammates will be able to help throw in their support, which they better be able to considering this is like the primary form of teamwork that occurs when exploring together. Mechanically, this also encourages having a diverse party with tons of different keywords and stat distributions, which is always a good thing in these types of games, so you get to not only interact with more of the game, but also see more of its gameplay combinations when working together. The character creation aspect of a ttrpg really is in full swing here. You can choose your body type with different minis, the starting items from different backgrounds, your race with its stat bumps, and all of these character creation choices come together to give you a bunch of keywords to really help flesh out who you are and how you want to present yourself. Like, it's awesome seeing how all these varying aspects of your character come into play in the storybook's redirections and choices. Really did not expect this goofy-ass moment where some hoity-toity dude you're escorting feels bad making a woman in the party do dangerous shit and you have to convince him to not put himself in harm's way for her. Or this other noble that starts muttering snide remarks when they see you have a dwarf in your party and that actually can fuck over negotiations. God, those moments were the most annoying shit in the best way. Like, yeah, your character's traits are definitely felt in this world. And finally, when it comes to group dynamics, there is this thing called a decision token that we like never used. But what it does is someone randomly starts with it, and they can use it to tie-break decisions before it rotates clockwise. Nice that this is there for groups where everyone isn't ride or die sharing the same brain cell. Would be hysterical if the token just lets you hard veto the decision, but I can understand why it's not like that. It's just there as another way to move the game forward smoothly, not contentiously. Final bits of campaign pros are talking about how the game tracks your decisions by putting markers into the story tracker. Really like how you don't have to constantly check off a box on a pen and paper. And while this may not seem like a ton of possible decisions, usually in between chapters, some of these will get cleared or moved so that the game keeps track of the big important decisions and not the immediate ones that only mattered for the last area you were in. And if there's any huge world-changing accolades for your party, those get slotted in at the bottom. But also, shout out to the app for being able to track the markers, because frankly, it does a better job with it since it also has the storybook verses in it. Whenever you have a branch that checks to see if you do/don't have a certain marker, the app will automatically let you know the status instead of having to refer back to the physical tracker. And of course, thank fuck they got an app, because that's just more and more feeling like a prerequisite nowadays if you want to make a big dumb campaign game. Especially the voiceover part for group play, so people don't have to exhaust themselves to read all this text text out loud. Oh, and another cool feature with the storybook is how in the back of it you can see what each marker means for your chapter and act in case you forgot what each marker was for what thing you did. Just be really careful not to spoil yourself. Last pro is that the story is in fact very replayable. However, you're still gonna have to get funneled into certain choke points. Like, there's some pretty pivotal bosses, but there's a ridiculous amount of ways to get there. Like deadass, our group wanted to play again, but with different characters and picking completely different paths, because after finishing, it really did feel like, damn, we could have done that so much differently if we wanted. There are entire side plots we completely missed, entirely different allies we could have persuaded, fights we skipped because we really wanted to just explore harder, you name it. I think the only thing in here that's not going to be really different on repeat plays would be puzzle solutions. But everything else you can influence in so many different ways because fights happen differently, super different characters and items opening up completely different options, entire sides of certain sheets we didn't spend that much time in. The thing I'm most curious about is that we happened to find silver bullet evidence so that we could upend Whitewell's state of affairs to flush out the killer. But like, how else would you have been able to interact with the city to set up that confrontation with the murderer? It seems like you can work pretty closely with all sorts of different parties within the city, on top of a lot of different ways to get brownie points with them depending on all sorts of actions you did way beforehand. Cons, components. Okay, Awaken Realm seems to love doing this, but there are certain minis that are way too big for the small grid square we got. This murderer man, biggest offender, because not only does that cape block anyone behind him, it tends to weigh him down, causing him to fall over. Not an issue with most of the minis. Hell, it's even fine with the actual big blue guy, because they occupy 4 spaces. But when bro is big like a Bulgrim, sometimes they don't fit when there's a melee scuffle going on. The player boards can be super fiddly, especially when it comes to the advancement tokens for leveling up. And you gotta fill up most of this column with them when you're low level, because advancement thresholds get bigger and bigger as you move these tokens onto your character's advancements proper. However, this fiddliness is only an issue when it comes to setup and teardown, because this is annoying as hell to refill, but when actually playing, you only mess around with your board every once in a while, which actually feels super nice. Very minor con, small tokens are hard to remove and fiddly, who would have guessed? While it's not going to hamper actual gameplay, I can't help but feel like there's a better solution for tracking your EXP and advancements that doesn't involve a bunch of these tokens. Now, small tokens are a lot more accessible when they slot in so nicely into a dual layered board, right? Well, unfortunately, while both versions of the game will have these dummy thick player boards for the story tracker and hotbars, those will be single layered for the standard edition. This is acceptable for the hotbar, which is in principle super unneeded because you're just flipping cards, but nice to have. For the story tracker though, dude, you are putting in red cubes constantly in like 24 tiny slots. Not having recesses to hold components in a board is fine if like there's a big pool and you're dumping damage tokens or something, but anytime there's a need for small particular slots, it's completely fucked. So it's looking like if you go with the standard edition, just use the app to track this. And this, a prototype tray, super mid. No idea what the final storage solution is gonna look like, but it better be really goddamn good if there's gonna be so many different small tokens thanks to the nature of the player board. Cause right now, since there's no clean delineations for organization, it's just a bunch of slots and you put things wherever, I think I would have preferred just having a bunch of plastic bags. Especially because oftentimes I'd want to divide tokens that are the same size and can go into the same slot. Like as an example, your character creation stuff. I'd want to have races, backgrounds, and professions in different slots. Equipment doesn't have identifier codes like the cards, so this is a preemptive concern because if the final game ends up having a ton of items, this is gonna get annoying to dig through. Pouches for storing your unequipped stuff are really small, to the point that I didn't even use them because they need to be much bigger by the time you start offloading a handful of items and action cards. The advancement help cards, which are player rates for leveling up, should have brief descriptions of actions you can unlock instead of being the same on both sides, because now I gotta dig through the action card pile to see what my unlock does. And these last ones aren't really cons, but more like quality of life changes. The actions and enemy activation cards do look a little boring. Not sure what can be done to improve that without curb stomping their sleek readability away. Super functional as is, and most board games don't go above and beyond anyways. It's just that Awaken Realms games are so freaking beautiful that something which is by all intents and purposes perfectly acceptable sort of stands out. Obviously I'll take the readability over aesthetics though, because other games may choose to condense everything down into a paragraph and that's how they'd make space for art. But space is a premium when it comes to small cards. Finally, the character portrait that slots into the board is a really weird shape, which does look super fancy, but kind of surprised by the decision to do that and have the pre-built characters here, because like, wouldn't you want something closer to a regular rectangle if you want to encourage people who wanted to make their own art and name tile style of their character so they can more easily make their own piece that slots in. As is, looks great and is a step above most other games' character setups, and you could just technically print something and tape it over. But in my opinion, this could be more accessibly customizable to pull in TTRPG players who do go the extra mile into character creation and either draw or commission sick art for their characters. As for the rest of the prototype that looks a little jank, another reminder that this is a prototype, so like I can literally see on the campaign page that pieces are going to be way cooler in the final version. Like as an example, the dials and initiative tokens are going to look better than what's here. Can't really talk about that, and Awaken Realms usually makes super cool, overproduced yet badass components, so I'm not really worried on that end. Moving on. Gameplay cons. Honestly, all I could really come up with is that the balance is possibly a little wacky, which at this point is just a funny bit from Awaken Realms, because I swear to God, they always run into a thing where like halfway through you just break the game. Thankfully though, no game was broken here, but I did feel very strong at some point. So first off, when it comes to the different progression trees for the classes, they literally have the same problem as D&D 5e, where some of them are way more single attribute dependent than others, which I find hysterical that the TTRPG influence is this on point. Like if you're a fighter who's just pumping their shit out of strength and then taking every single action that uses strength, your build is just straight up going to be putting out higher numbers in all facets in comparison to someone like a paladin who is multi-attribute dependent from charisma and whatever melee type you prefer, like strength or agility. This ends up functionally doing less damage and defending as a result. The charisma-based actions and the melee attacks each end up doing less than the pure strength dude who's always rolling like 2 more dice on their attacks. Really not sure how to address that while keeping things straightforward, because the classic problem that comes up from this is if you then make the upgrade paths less synergistic to combat this, leveling up sucks and feels like garbage. But if it's too focused on a single stat, then like why wouldn't you just pick everything that scales off your highest stat? Really interested in seeing if and or how this gets addressed. On that note, my super roided out fighter guy at a certain point in the game just outright stopped taking damage from attacks. Like obviously they were still threatened from the storybook, but like in combat I unequipped healing, that's how tanky I was. I gave myself 3 defensive reactions that all used strength. I had 5 strength because I just kept pumping it up. I had this careful attack that further buffs defensive reactions, and I had armor that reduced all damage by 1. Most of the time, enemies are attacking for like 2 to 5 damage, and I didn't take a single bit of it once I was this juiced and got my shield and armor. Also, I hit really hard because yeah, 5 dice rolls plus the innate damage from the weapon you're using means enemies were getting decimated. Single attribute dependent, single brain cell smash. Also, not the most convinced that having a ton of players isn't going to make the game too easy, because from what I've seen for combat, each player basically just adds like 1 extra minion and 2 extra hits worth of health to the big bad, which didn't feel like it counteracted all the upside of having another character who's a whole nother health bar that functionally throws out way more numbers worth of extra attacks and supports throughout the encounter. Exploration felt fine though, because there's often hard skill checks that scale off player count by making the number of successes you need per player. Oh, and the initiative bag, while a cool system and definitely better than rolling for turn order, does incentivize having someone who should just always have an action that adds extra white chips, and to have that person always go first to load up the bag and counteract disadvantaged initiative setups. After all, there's no reason to not do this early and risk cumulatively more likely opportunities for enemies to take back-to-back turns. Not sure what the solution to this would be, but there's definitely a way to make initiative manipulation matter without it becoming a default opener when applicable. Maybe if the initiative bag had more total chips in it from the start so that massively influencing it is more difficult? Don't know. But overall, the funny thing about these gameplay cons is that they really didn't feel like they mattered that much. Because of the more TTRPG nature of Lands of Evershade, moments of poorer balance just don't really hurt it as much. Especially if you're super invested in the overall story and less in combat mechanics. Even more so if you're very willing to bet it all on black and do wacky secret sheet exclusive actions. Despite all of these being legitimate issues, their presence really wasn't felt much. Like, even though I didn't take any combat damage deeper in, I was still being threatened and was almost eliminated twice thanks to unique circumstances. One of those being a terror-based fight, and the other being the final boss having crazy special rules that can just bypass traditional defenses as you position yourself carefully around his special rules that I'm not going to spoil. So even though I personally felt the experience was overall a bit on the easier side, that probably means it's going to be pretty good for a lot of people. And this is something that could also just be solved with difficulty options anyways. I don't want to have a skill issue in the opposite direction and advocate for the default difficulty to be harder and just end up making the experience worse, first for most people, when I'd argue so much of the focus here is in the game's superb use of mechanics and art as narrative tools. Campaign cons! As per usual with a lot of campaign games that use this kind of system, it's pretty easy to forget what the story marker letters were. And yes, they are listed in the back of the storybook, but that's still not ideal because easy spoilers. Because when it's described in their words, it can still make you do a double take, like, wait, that's what I did? Not a huge deal, because at this point when playing an Awaken's Realms campaign game, you honestly should be taking notes for everything you're doing and potential leads, not just for remembering what decisions end up marking things. So I suppose the only reasonable fix I can think of would just be letting the app have a notes section in it somewhere, and letting you add your own notes to the markers to better recall them in your own words. Though honestly, you probably should just be using the app in the first place, because the back of the storybook that explains all the story tracker markers is a verse. So if you go to it via the app, it hides everything from you except the markers you actually want to see. Also, when it comes to the back of the storybook, verse 1000, don't know if we're stupid or if this issue is on the prototype, but I got no idea what you actually do gameplay-wise that directs you to this verse, because we kind of just accidentally found it. But I'm still blaming the game, because if it's this easy to miss, that's a problem, because this is definitely a feature that should be shouted from the rooftops. Last thing about the app is that it would be so nice if there was a place you can save your character's loadouts here, because not only would that bypass the need for a save sheet, but it can also double as a keyword checker, so that when you're using the app instead of the storybook, it can automatically pick out which keywords your party has available for checks, similarly to how it does the story tracker markers. Next, playing solo is possibly going to make you lose out on tons of options, because like, how is assisting and keywords going to work? The game is clearly balanced around these things in mind, but like having a bigger party just opens so many more doors and is much better at controlling outcomes as a result. So I'm curious to see how they're going to buff solo to make it work, because it sounds pretty frustrating to be blocked off from a ton of options unless you somehow have good stats and everything. Also, a goofy interaction we noticed is that because of how character death works, the dead dude gives all of their possessions to the rest of the party. But like, technically speaking, if you can figure out a controlled way to keep killing off your character when everyone's level 1, you could just farm a ton of gold in starting gear. Not gonna matter in later levels, but it does mean that they gotta be extra careful with designing the early game to not allow players to do something like that. Maybe this is completely fine and such an exploit doesn't even exist in the storybook, but who knows? And it's not like they should be putting stuff in that can deal big damage outside of combat to newcomers in the first place. Combat is fine though, because you can't really repeat farm one-time story-relevant combat encounters. The final con is that in character creation, race should probably be swapped out for like ancestry or species or whatever other random term every other TTRPG seems to be doing nowadays. Probably isn't random, I'm sure there's thought put behind it. Point is, race doesn't even make sense. Like, look, human, jacked bugbear-looking Bulgrim. Obviously a different species and way more apt wording, especially if we're giving innate mechanical differences between them, like stats and basic actions. And if we want to go really above and beyond, don't even include the innate mechanical differences and instead just let character creation give you a select amount of keywords and some number of stat and basic action adjustments for even more crazy character creation options. Like, what if you wanted to play an elf who was small and super agile, but also a fucking idiot? That sounds hilariously fun and is the type of character creation options that make replayability go even further. But yeah, don't want to unintentionally do none of that biological essentialism here, because like, why are we making all elves and dwarves their own monoliths? Surely not all dwarves are innately jaded and jacked basement dwellers who love crafting. It leaves room for more interesting world developments if it's like the biggest dwarg nation is like that, because then what if you wanted to write in a different ethnicity of dwarves who don't mind being above ground and are actually super enthusiastic and hopeful? I guess you can just choose never to write them like that, but then that's saying all dwarves are born with the basement dweller gene, and it kind of feels fucked up to have a species that's sentient, intelligent, and capable of communication being so pigeonholed. Surely my city-born dwarf character who just does, I don't know, tax collecting doesn't just one day get an irresistible urge to start crafting things. Like, you aren't born with knowledge, you learn that shit from what's around you. Tentative score. Now, because this is a prototype, we're not going to do a recommender score since it's obviously not a finished product, but seeing what we got and evaluating Lands of Evershade's prototype as a showcase of its mechanics, how well is it doing the premise of blending TTRPG and board game adventure campaign in a seamlessly smooth epic choose your own adventure and grid combat experience? It's a 9 out of 10. An excellent job. It's super impressive how the only outright con is just the balance in a select few areas, such as certain class progression. Now, this arguably doesn't even hurt it that much due to the nature of the game being so story-driven and RNG heavy. The rest of the issues are basically just prototype jank or stuff that can be improved but can also just be fine as is. Overall, Lands of Evershade hits its notes really well, and if you're looking for a campaign adventure board game to delve into, this one is hard not to recommend. Unless all you care about is combat, in which case this this is a tough sell, because I think in all of our 17 hours, give or take, we did like 5 battles. You can do more. I think you can also do even less. So if that's an issue, then hopefully they add in even more combat encounters. But again, I don't think combat for the sake of combat is the defining aspect of the game, because each of these scarcer fights matters so much more because of the story that leads you there. Unlike Tainted Grail, there are no random fights. Everything is from the storybook, and most likely whatever fight you're doing has a lot riding on the line after like an hour or two of story. So to that exploration, choose your own adventure, story-driven end, the fundamentals of Lands of Evershade are superb. And I am not at all worried in the slightest about this game coming out in a questionable state. They have a winning rule set here and a creative team that can do so much. So now it's just a question of if the polish and quality of life is going to be there with balancing tweaks and proofreading and good rulebook, organization, packaging, yada yada. Remember, I get to have a direct line of communication with Awaken Realms. You don't, because since the rulebook right now is obviously just a Google Docs page, I of course asked a ton of questions and got them all answered whenever there was unclear, missing, or outright incorrect wording. Like, what the hell is crush damage? Rulebook literally doesn't have it, and I completely forgot about this while playing because it like never came up and I didn't ask about it in time while making this video. Same with zone borders, whether or not you get fate when rolling a 1 on a div die. And also the final fight was outright missing a mechanic because it had a thing at some point involving removing markers for a boss ability, but we could not find how many markers to start with, so we just made up a hard number because fuck it, we ball. My friend's Bulgrim cop character died from that. Rip in peace, he fell in battle while upholding the law like the true paladin he was. Basically, how much do you trust Awaken Realms to deliver the cherry on top? I'm looking at you, Lands of Evershade team. Just because I said this shit is peak and obviously made by smart and creative and beautiful and wonderful people who obviously know what they're doing and making it out of the calcs with this one, doesn't mean y'all can't get complacent. Balls in your court, don't choke this shit. And as a reminder, because of the nature of this game with its simple fundamental rules but then wacky secret cheat special rules, that means that it's more likely that errors and unclear wording rears its ugly head, because not only is the game almost entirely special rules, everything is functioning independently from each other. Your mileage lies entirely on how well they do the unique one-off secret sheet rules. So it wouldn't surprise me if in the final product of like, I don't know, close to 50 sheets if 1 or 2 of them has a fuck up, or doesn't cover some edge case interaction. But if you're super invested, you'll probably hug online forums and FAQs and not care about that, or if you're a ttrpg brain, you might not care regardless and just make up a ruling and move on, which honestly suits this game if you're from that crowd. And if you're a patient buyer, second printings always avoid the first printing jank. Counterpoint though, it can be surprising at how certain gameplay situations can arise in which ruling clarity didn't pull through, because as an anecdotal example, our group on sheet 3 ended up forgetting to go to a specific verse if you travel to a spot without a marker. Because we were being hilarious with our explorations and ended up covering most of the map in markers, our moves weren't triggering special rules up until the end. So we kind of just forgot about that, and there was only like 2 or 3 instances where that rule should have activated after we already moved around like 15 times, which made it super easy to forget. This is hilarious because it meant that we didn't give everyone secret origins, because this is where the game gives them to you. I ended up noticing way later, but thankfully it didn't matter because I went and read these secret origins and learned they're unfinished in this prototype anyways. And we only ran into like 3 things that check for them in the first place. Would love to see how that mechanic gets expanded upon, because it sounds awesome for making your characters even more tangibly connected to the world. And if they manage to make secret origins tie back into the main story, that's a W custom character incorporation. I swear this is the last time I ever have the board game faced away from me, because everything is upside down for me. Clearly that wasn't my fault. I'm obviously super duper perfect and never get rules wrong. Man, it's so cool seeing how Awaken Realms have grown, because I remember the stark contrast with OG Fall of Avalon having random dice checks that just wasted time since they were repeatable. And there was way more choose your own adventure or bullshit that super punished you with barely any warning. Then Kings of Ruin introduced time passing, made more deterministic stat checks over rolls, and made getting fucked up way more telegraphed, on top of adding in ways to burst heal so you don't waste a bunch of time sitting around slowly healing. Now with Lands of Evershade, they've gone back to just making you roll for everything, but it works so much better now because of the ttrpg influence. I'm personally very confident in this because of my bias from seeing what they did with Tainted Grail. And I truly believe they got the best they could out of that system that I always said had some inherent flaws in it. But this is new age shit that addresses those flaws. The rules actually make sense for group play now, and every fight feels like it goes so hard. They were able to learn from and improve Tainted Grail, and now I see that they've learned even more and made better Tainted Grail. Damn straight you better believe I believe in this game. So much so that as much as I'd love to do one of those things where there's a spoiler section and just gush about everything, I'm actually not going to do that in this prototype stage. I think this is worth playing and experiencing for yourself. Very excited to get my hands on the final release of this. Hopefully I laid out well who this is for, and if this sounds like your jam, I think it's worth backing. My personal score. If it wasn't made abundantly clear by now, this is what I've always wanted out of Tainted Grail, which has always had amazing exploration, but the combat made me eventually want to chop my dick off for being so tedious and disconnected from the story. except Kings of Ruin boss fights. It was also only mechanically okay to me. Playing such a limited amount of cards didn't have me loving it enough to want to do it 5 million times. And I've also always wanted a version where there's significantly less combat so you can focus on the story, with the combat only popping up in key moments when it was built up and actually mattered. Well, guess what? Lands of Evershade is literally just that. So it's a 9 out of 10 excellent time for me. And I would give the Shelfside certified award to it, but I feel like that's capped considering this isn't a final product. As a reminder, that's like our X Factor thing for when something just hits different, and we gotta give it props for really doing something special personally. So what would make this a 10 out of 10? Basically, if everything had that final layer of polish, so all the rules are there and cleaned up, if there's a sick organizer, and if they somehow do the Oathsworn thing where all the enemy minis and cards are hidden until you actually need them. Like, come on, there's gotta be a way to design this where you use the identifier codes to hide cards so you only search for them by that code, right? Also do that for the camp cards. I don't know why they don't have the identifiers on their back, because I want to keep them hidden and not know what NPCs are capable of tagging along with the party. Oh, and I guess I'd like it if the combat was heavier, but I'm not even 100% sure on that, because like that would only be for solo play, because if I'm playing with friends, I absolutely would not want that to be the case just so we can keep the game moving faster. Running up and rolling dice at a thing provides more than enough tension and entertainment for me, assuming there's a ton of novelty behind what those rolls are for, which definitely isn't a problem here between all the different action cards, constantly new enemies, and secret sheet shenanigans. Point is, I have a feeling the only reason this isn't a 10 out of 10 is because it's a prototype, so I had to deal with jank, but otherwise, a very creative dark fantasy world, a check. The Soulsborne vibes, yes sir. Well-written choose-your-own adventure that's super congruent with the mechanics, you bet your ass. A grid-based combat pseudo dungeon crawler dice trucker, sick minis moving around, oh! Don't know why I yelled there, honestly, that kind of combat mostly fell off for me after becoming a fan of Gloom/Frosthaven, because a lot of it is just run up to the guy, hit each other until someone dies. Thankfully though, this game dodges that trap because of special rules. Certain enemies love to run around the arena, and because the story is so strong. Like, so long as the combat isn't garbage and getting in the way of the story, I'm probably gonna have a good time. But this game is a far cry from that thanks to how well the exploring and fighting play off each other with outcomes drastically affecting each other. Combat just feels like an extension of the story, and I'm okay with it being a bit lighter as a result. Especially because it does co-op justice and has me super engaged with everything that's going on, even on other people's turns because of all the supporting that's happening. I value that a lot, because when my ideal board gaming experience is getting friends together to constantly be yelling and interacting with each other, campaign games don't often get to join in. Sometimes it's a matter of commitment from people, sometimes they just work better solo. Which is a shame because I love these types of games, and I think experiencing their stories is kind of inherently makes them a lot more memorable than so many other board games. So getting something like this, which still has a ton of hours in it across the 3 adventures, yet also has the capability to be completed with a group satisfyingly because it's pretty reasonable to meet up enough to play through one of them, jives so well with me. And if I can play Lands of Evershade with dudes that I don't normally play board games with but would be way more down for TTRPGs, that's something sorely missing that I needed. I played through the prototype with one of those guys, who by the way gives this game an 8, which is massive because like most things are a 5 for him, who used to play more board games like years ago before decidedly sticking with D&D, Pathfinder, and video games. He, among many of my friends, have the sentiment where a lot of board games just feel like shitty video games, and I honestly can't really fault them for that. Like, I even know guys that'd rather just do everything on TTS because it takes like half the time. And because I want to hang out with them too and not just my board gamer friends, that's why games like this find their place with me. Because they pull in people who need tabletop games to make actual use of their physicality and benefit from everyone sitting down at a table together. Which is why D&D 5e is a banger, and also why they'd rather play video games over a lot of board games. It's why stuff like hilariously extra deluxe components and sick minis also do well with me, and I can't wait to see the finished product components because Awaken Realms always kills it there. Presentation matters, people, and if I got my friends asking me when this game comes out and calling it Analog Baldur's Gate 3 with an Elden Ring aesthetic, that's like the highest badge of honor. Thank you all for making it to the end. Drop a like on the video and consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/shelfside. Or if you want to make a one-time donation, check out coffee.com/shelfside if you'd like to support us. Our donation pool is currently at $911, and if I'm gonna make a giant unsponsored review again, this has gotta hit like the 3K if I'm gonna spend like 3 months on a video because I need rent and food, you know. I am interested in more dummy bigs like Madara and Tenaris, even completing games like Oathsworn or Aeon Trespass, because someone told me they finally finished the whole thing. You'll be able to vote once the donation pool gets to that point. Thanks so much for watching, and here's some random footage for the outro because that was such a hit last time.
I'm happy that I got to be the one character death. That's pretty cool.
Of course it was fucking you.
Pretty good. I think pretty good. I'm surprised. Aren't you not allowed to film this?
Oh yeah. Oh, fuck, I'm sorry. Okay, okay, now it's good. Now it's good.
I guess the best possible thing I could say about it is that when this game comes out, I would like to play the rest of it.
Shame
which is, I guess, the ideal thing that you'd want out of a prototype.
And I think we'll just get better with more content, smoothing out the weird little like rough patches, you know?
I feel like leveling up feels jank, and currently a lot of the upgrades do not feel well thought out.
They feel like thought to me for like literally only for just like going down one path, like obvious shit like fighter, it's like, I am strength.
Oh, mad versus sad. Yeah. Single attribute dependent versus multi-attribute dependent. Because mad characters are always bad, while sad characters are always good. I think in 5e, the classic example of like a character who's way too sad and it makes him overpowered are warlocks who go with Hexblade, because you get to be a spellcaster who's also a melee character, but your melee attribute is also your spellcasting attribute because of charisma is what your Hexblade gets to run off of for attack and damage rolls, which is stupid. And then that allows you to then multi-class into things like Paladin or Sorcerer because they're also charisma-based casters.
I forgot how much everyone in 5e was just charisma. Well, like one or two in things really, and then like
there's technically in the base game there's only a single like actual intelligence class, and that's Wizard. Debatably, Rogue has like intelligence builds that you could use, and it would be good with them because they're supposed to be skill monkeys. And then Artificer adds like an actual other intelligence character or intelligence class to the game.
Right, that's not part of the base, yeah.
Mm-hmm. What are the charisma ones? I think it's Warlock, Sorcerer, Paladin, and I think there's like another one.
Bard, Sorcerer, Paladin, Warlock.
Oh, Bard. I was forgetting Bard. Of course I was forgetting Bard.
That's a huge chunk of fucking classes.
Yeah, no, that's a third. That was like the problem is the moment they released Hexblade, it created like a multi-classing is already like really broken in 5e if you know what you're doing. And it's completely disgusting, and that is probably like the worst defender is the Hexblade Warlock. Like being able to do damage with your melee attack at level 1. It's only crazy like that.
That's just made for multi-classing. Like,
yeah, no, it is. The Warlock level 1 dip is very infamous in 5e. I do think it's not like a flaw with Paladin. It's maybe a bit, I don't know. But I did notice when I was looking through all the level up stuff for Hunter is also kind of mad that you want like agility, intelligence, and also possibly charisma, and also possibly strength. You probably mostly want agility, but there's quite a few different things where intelligence comes up, where it's like focus, which gets you like a boon or whatever if you use it. What was the other one? Take aim. There was another one I read that also was like intelligence based. There's quite a few like actually like cards that you get when playing Hunter that are intelligence based, and then there's a few charisma based ones that also surprised me. And then when you look at their track, they have 3 different ways to get a +1 to agility. You have a way to get a +1 to strength, a way to get you have two different ways to get a +1 to intelligence, and you also have a way to get a +1 to charisma.
It sounds like you still go pretty heavily to agility though if you want.
Yeah.
It's like technically is the minute fighter, right? Like
yeah.
This is that but reverse. Like it's 3 strength, 1 agility, and then a little bit in.
Oh yeah, you also have a charisma one, don't you?
There's like one randomly that means like
agility, strength.
I mean, because how this game is, like, I feel like since there's only 4 stats, it's probably fine to do stuff like where it's like, let's just put most of it in one, and you can do a little bit in the other ones just to make it so it's not like unplayable during the exploration parts, you know?
Yeah.
I placed everything in it.
So I play everything at strength there because I was just like, I mean, you guys got the other stats, right? I love how much we were just lacking agility as a group, though. That was like, how it's so funny.
It's pretty funny.
But yeah, like stat-wise, yeah, I feel like, I guess that is like the weakness of like, you know, it's more thematic to have 6 stats. I do like on this game, it's like, there is that board game streamlinification, which is like, here's 4. Honestly, if you're like a human, just have 2 and everything.
I'm fine with it. I'm fine with their stat spread, considering like B is its own thing, isn't connected to any of the stats. That's fine. Because I think if I was to think about like what are the 2 stats that you have to like kill in 5e, it's Constitution and it's fucking Wisdom. Wisdom is stupid.
There is something very cool here that I noticed is that like, I think being super mad might not actually be as fucked up in this because just play a human and then like just get like a ton of stats to 3 and you're probably fine because like I don't know, once you start rolling because fate exists, like once you start rolling like 4, like 5 die for a check, I feel like it is honestly a little overkill. Like TBH, like having a bunch matters for like damage, but like for just doing like checks in games, like which is what you're doing a lot of the time anyways.
There really isn't like a crazy amount of combat in the game. Yeah, especially if you're. I'm fine. I especially think it's fine if you're playing Rogue. Like if you're playing Rogue, you probably want to have some intelligence, some agility, and some charisma. because God knows you're going to be doing a lot of all three. You
like
need the agility to sneak around, you probably need the intelligence to do some lockpicking, and you need the charisma for when you get caught.
That just seems like a solid time. You're just be a human rogue and just good at everything. Like that's like kind of like the bard in this game, I guess.
But yeah, pretty good game. I liked it. Probably out of any like board game, role-playing game, this is the best one I played. But it's the only one that like by the end of it, I was like, oh, this is good, and I like this, and it has its own niche, and it doesn't just make me be like, I want to just be playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, there's more story in this than in most of my D&D campaigns.
Yes. No, actually, unironically. Which is, that makes sense because they get to pre-write the entire thing, and like they limit the amount of choices while still having a decent amount.
Yeah, I feel like there's still like while we're playing it, it always felt like, damn, there was some crazy other shit we could have been doing.
Yes. There is enough choices in this that I would be like willing to play it again.
And also like do a completely different like build too. Just,
exactly. Yeah, 100, like without a doubt. The combat system is pretty good. I'm happy that like the entire time I was playing, I feel like there are choices, but not so many so that like every turn takes like a million years of weighing decisions and like rating your fuckload of choices.
Also, you're like always able to like help people, right? Like
the reactions is a great system. I would say I would consider making more reactions.
Yeah, I want to see more reactions.
Reactions are a very good thing in any turn-based RPG that involves multiple people because it makes you more engaged when other people are taking their turn, which is something that is a good thing, in my opinion. The level at which you cannot truly calculate, like, you could calculate the random chance, but they hide it between enough of, like, there's too many die being rolled, the difficulty checks are fucking weird, and we're using D12s, which D12s already makes it harder to do the math. It puts up a stronger barrier to not just be, like, trying to fucking count cards and just be, like, the meme of, like, the guy having all the equations while he's sitting there doing blackjack or whatever. If you have a lot of, like, die rolling and it's a tabletop RPG, that is, like, the exact feeling of what you should be aiming for. The players can ballpark the risk, but they can't exactly calculate the risk, at least easily, because it makes players take decisions faster, which is always good, and players are like more willing to make mistakes, which is always fun for narrative. If a player 100%. Can like calculate out risks too much, well, one, he's gonna take his time to do that, while everybody else is like, Doc, are you serious? Just fucking do it. And then they're probably going to start doing really dumb, risk-averse things. It's like, you're being lame right now. You're being lame. Stop doing that. Can't be the kid swats how to rock a cardboard. You just have to be the dude. You have to be the Big Lebowski of rolling fucking die and just being like, I'm gonna vibes it out, brother. Let's go. I got a fate point. Yeah. Like, if you pass the check, there should be like 3 tiers. There should be like a nothing tier, like you didn't instantly die. Good job. Of course, they should keep the instantly die. I'm a big fan of the instantly die. I think that's a sick thing to have. But there should be, like, if you get a lot of successes, something cool happens. It doesn't have to be like an auto.
For this fight only, your dividend dice goes up by 1 value, right? Like.
Yeah, something like that. I'm fine with that. Well, I mean, if it's just for one fight only, just give the person a D20.